I'm Alexandra Larson. I am the Marketing and Communications Director here in the Faculty of Science. I'm quite new to this role, just stepped into it at the end of September. My background's in kind of agency side, strategic planning, and also a bit of copywriting. And then the second half of my career is mostly spent corporate side, building marketing teams and helping with planning and processes. So very excited to bring that to the world of academia with the Faculty of Science. On the call today, we do have Marianne Moser, who many of you know. So, Marianne is our science communicator in residence, and this is a program that some of you have had the benefit of working with already, but this program really is a unique one. So, we have only the second program in Canada. I believe there's only one other one across Canada. And the vision for this program, what we're really trying to do is ensure that we are telling science stories in a way that is the most compelling as possible, also extremely accurately, and making sure that people feel really, really prepared to share their exciting research and breakthroughs and insights with the world in a way that's going to get us the most traction, but also hopefully that results in the most funding. So Marianne does work one-on-one with people, pulling out the compelling threads from the research stories and making it really relatable and understandable to people. So that, and then also additional work with storytelling. So that's a little bit about our Science Communicator in Residence program. And throughout the new year, we'll also be releasing a few additional opportunities to engage with Marianne and the program. So stay tuned for those.
Thank you very much, Alex. And actually, I'm excited today because going to introduce you in a minute and have a conversation in just a minute with somebody who is at the University of Calgary and is a greater resource than I could ever be for all of you when it comes to all things media. Colette Derworiz is an award-winning journalist. She has been covering daily news for 25 years. She has a long career, very seasoned and respected and admired by fellow journalists. In her career, she's covered almost every beat: politics, education, health, the environment, and breaking news, including serving as a news correspondent for AAAS's publication Science. And I'm only using that acronym because I know this is a science audience. She also spent a semester in the Faculty of Law as a journalist in residence, but now she is the permanent science communications media specialist in residence. That's not her actual title. So Colette, let's have a conversation. I'm going to play the role of a scientist and try and ask the kinds of provocative or even the questions that they might be too intimidated to ask. And I want to start with how sensational it seems the media is. It seems they're interested when there's some sort of crisis or major breakthrough. And to be perfectly honest, my role as a scientist is all about daily, weekly, monthly, yearly rigor and methodology. So in a nutshell, my question is, the way science appears in the media is kind of at odds with the way my science works. Am I going to be able to tell my story in a way that I want?
I think so. I think that definitely there's daily news that needs science involved, and that's kind of the message I'm giving here, is that you need to be prepared to respond to daily news because your science is part of daily life, but it requires preparation. Like, I think you need to be ready for those interviews. I see Dan's here, so I'm gonna call him out. There was a story this summer where some rock fall fell in Banff, and within a couple hours of that, Dan and I had a conversation, and he was like, "I can speak to this," because it was his science, right? And so we got Dan on the 6 o'clock news that night. And then he became the person that everybody went to. So I think if it fits in your science and you're comfortable talking about it, by all means, we should do it. And yes, your science takes time, but that means, like, you're an expert on these things, so you should be willing to talk about it, and that's why journalists come to you.
So sometimes my concern about being seen as a scientist who's, providing those kind of sound bites for those big breaking stories is that it could negatively affect my reputation with other scientists because, I'm going to look like my, my work is too simple. Is this a
So
valid concern?
yeah, sure. Like I think everybody's concerned about potentially having their work simplified too much, right? But the
Mm-hmm.
thing is you have to know your audience here, right? So if a journalist is calling you, oftentimes they're working for a daily media outlet that is responding to some sort of news. And so you have to realize that the people either watching or reading that news or seeing it or hearing it on the radio are looking for you to provide clarity on things, right? So if you
Mm-hmm.
can come in with a good explanation of the science of it, again, going back to that, science is part of daily life, and that's kind of the message I'm trying to preach in my new role here, then I think it's really valuable for the general public, right? So your audience in this case isn't other scientists, and you have to remember that, right? Your other scientist audience is when you put out a paper. In this case, you're dealing with people as young as, kids who are watching the news, right? To grandparents, right? So who have never studied science.
Yeah. I understand that those mainstream audiences might be wanting a simpler version of science. I guess I'm just wondering about what I can do to make sure that when it gets simplified, it doesn't lose its accuracy or doesn't put me in a bad light.
Yeah, and that's a legitimate concern. I think the key here is preparation, right? So if you can prepare what you want to say ahead of time, have kind of three simplified messages that you want to get out on a specific thing, and then be able to communicate that well, that really matters, and that also makes it easy for the journalist to understand. In my role here, I always say to scientists and a few of you I've worked with, if you can explain it to me as a non-scientist, then I can explain it to the rest of the population, right? So I might ask a lot of really dumb questions in my role here, but it's so that I understand it. And I think the same can be said for working journalists out there, right? Is that they're all a different level of knowledge, right? So some journalists do have a science background if you're working specifically with a science journalist. So when I was working for the Science Journal news coverage, but not all do, right? So some, like I was a history major before I was a journalism major, right? So just remember that.
Hmm. So this has happened before where I've been interviewed by a reporter and it sounds like they understand what I'm talking about. And then I see the story or even the headline and it really feels misconstrued. What can I do about that?
So I think first of all, you have to remember that headlines aren't usually written by the reporter who's writing the story. So that's why you need to explain yourself even better. And then they may act like they understand, but sometimes just like getting them to read it back to you, or getting them to um, or just asking them, like, have I explained myself clearly, right? Put it back on yourself, right? Like,
Mhm.
so sometimes you just have to ask those follow-up questions and say, like, do you understand what I mean by this, or something like that, just to make it clear.
Mhm.
But yeah, usually a headline is made to draw the reader in, and it's
Mhm.
not going to be based specifically on your comments in most cases. It'll be based on kind of overarching story, right? So it is meant to draw the reader in, though. So sometimes they can be a little bit, you know, attention grabbing.
Mhm. Mhm. Um, Another thing that I see happening sometimes is, that, my comments as a scientist get paired with somebody else's comment who disagrees with me or sees the world in a different way than me. And I'm uncomfortable with that. Is there anything I can do about that?
Not really. Like some stories are meant to be debate stories, right? I think
Mhm.
we've seen a lot of that lately with some of the news that's out there right now. There was a story recently in the Calgary Herald that was about the new pipeline, with three different economists talking about their views on how it could help or hurt, kind of thing, and it was very much they didn't agree, right? So in science, I think it might be more clear. Uh, like I always just say, like, stick to your science, and I wouldn't worry about what the story does. Like your section is going to have your section, right? So
Mhm. So is
there's not
is
much you
that a
can do.
thing? A debate story? Like would the writer be setting up or setting out to write a story that would be, thought of as a debate story?
In some cases, yeah, if a story's going on for a really long time, they'll reach out to a series of experts to see how they respond to it. In some cases, the story is experts agree that this is a bad idea. In some cases, it's a story that says, experts disagree on these points. So
Mhm.
yeah, it can happen.
So could I ask to see a story before it goes to print or before it gets broadcast to make sure I'm comfortable with how I'm being depicted?
Not usually. Most journalists won't share a story beforehand. Sometimes they'll read you back your quote or what they're going to use. Sometimes they'll give you a sense of like where they're going with it and how you fit into it. But typically they won't let you see it. And the reason for that is this. Could you imagine if a journalist shared their story with every single source they interviewed, and government officials and politicians had a chance to vet the story before it went to air or went to print? Um, that everything would be varnished, right? So sometimes a government, like a politician, for example, will say something and then regret it the next day, right? So if you were to go back, you wouldn't have any truth really. Like it could really damage the story, right? So
Yeah,
they're
I
not
don't
going
want
to
to.
make exceptions for a scientist, right?
Yeah, yeah, I don't want to be seen as a varnished scientist. Um, so what do I do if it seems like a reporter has an agenda? Or can I even ask, what's the slant of this story?
Like I most journalists go in like generally without an angle. Like I certainly, when I was working as a journalist, would call a scientist or an expert to explain something more. And it might change the angle of the story, right? Like if you had a certain conception of where a story was going, and then a scientist were to provide their expertise, it might actually change it, right? So I
Mhm.
think most journalists are really trying to find the best representation of the truth, right? So um, they're coming to you because they see you as an expert and want you to provide your information on it. So,
Okay. So what if they ask me tough questions or critical questions that I don't want to answer? Can I just say no comment?
I guess it depends what you mean by a tough question. Like if it's a tough question that you can't answer because it's not your science, then by all means you should say that. Like you
Mhm.
shouldn't feel like you have to answer a question that you're not an expert on. So you would just say that's not my area.
Okay.
And that's totally fair. I think most journalists are going to understand that. And if it's a tough question, like putting you, I don't know, what would be a tough question? What would be a tough question, Maria?
Is this right or wrong? Like if,
uh,
yeah,
yeah, so the nuances, I guess.
or is
Um,
this going to cause harm to, X, Y, or Z?
I think as long as you stick to the science, then you don't you're not speaking in a turn, right? So it's once you start adding an opinion to things that becomes a bit risky.
Okay. So try not to get drawn into offering my opinion on one of these tough questions. Okay.
Unless your science supports it. Yeah,
Okay. Okay.
yeah.
Got it. So you kind of touched on this. What if I'm asked to comment on something, an area that's not my area of expertise, but might be kind of tangential, or I'm trained to some degree in it. Um, can I can I comment on the areas like that? I mean, I know that misinformation will step in where there's a gap. Rumor loves a vacuum, right? So I have an obligation to talk about these things, but I'm not an expert in all these things.
Yeah, like I think if it's basic science that you're asked to comment on and you're comfortable talking about that, then that's totally fine. I think anytime it veers away from your expertise, it's a good opportunity to either suggest a colleague or someone else who is an expert in that field. Say, like, I can only speak to this part of it. But I have this colleague that studies that exact topic. So would you mind if I pass this on to them?
Okay, pass the buck and share the workload.
Mhm.
It does seem to me that you see, a handful of scientists in the news a lot more than others. Um, I know in the olden days it was called the Carl Sagan effect, or where if you spend too much time in the media, your fellow colleagues start to think that you're not spending enough time in the lab. How do I negotiate that? Because it seems to me that when your science becomes newsworthy, it becomes, a full on, it can become a full-time job for a few days.
It can take over, right? Like we saw that with the example that I mentioned earlier, where you do one media interview and then several others follow, right?
Yeah.
So you do have to be anticipating a bit of a spotlight on you for a little bit.
Yeah.
Um, but I think that if you stick to your expertise, then you won't be out there for every single thing, right? And so we saw it. I see George is on the call. I didn't ask him if I could say this, but when George's research and his lab's research was mentioned in the Nobel Prize, um, he had huge attention, right? And but now, like, and it's going to continue for probably a little bit, right? Um, but it comes and goes. It comes in waves, right? When there's something that's relevant to what you work on, right? So
Yeah.
um, be prepared for those little blips, I guess. And I also see Elmer's on this call, right? So I worked with him for a week or two where he had a flurry of media interviews, right? So I think that it's a matter of just being prepared for that timeline, right? That there might be a lot of
Yeah.
interview requests, right? Because they see that you're an expert, and then they realize that they can call you.
Yeah. So let's say, in the middle of a couple of days like that, you give basically the same interview. And in some outlets, the story's great. And you come off looking how, you want to. And in others, it's kind of cringe. How do I navigate that or control for that?
Yeah, and I don't know that you can control for that. I think you just have to recognize that every journalist has a different level of understanding of things. So it goes back to that. Some journalists have a science background, some don't. Some journalists are political reporters, and some are, breaking news reporters. So just like I've had many different roles as a journalist, journalists are picking out certain things, right? So a business journalist might want different parts of your answer than an environmental journalist might.
Mhm.
So I think that the best thing you can do is be prepared, and there are various ways to prepare. There's like message boxes and stuff, which I think we'll share at the end of this, that you can have your messages ready to go, and so that you're giving the same message to the different journalists. Some journalists will ask different questions, which will lead to different answers, and some journalists are going to pick one answer over the other. And again, that's just based on where they're going with the story, right? Like if it's a business story versus an environmental story, for example.
And I can ask that, right? Where are you going with the story?
You can ask, like, yeah, you can ask anything you want. I guess they might not tell you, but you can also, like, if you get a request, just do a quick Google search on them, and you can find out yourself whether they're a business journalist, or you can call me now. I work for you guys, right? So,
Right.
and say, what do you know about this journalist? I know quite a few. So,
So being prepared, understanding the context in which the story might appear, understanding what the journalist might be, the type of story they might be trying to write, and then having your own messages, not rehearsed like a script, but rehearsed like an astronaut, where you just aren't going to stumble. You're not going to find yourself saying something you'll regret.
yeah, because I think journalists can be intimidating. So I think sometimes we do like feel like once a camera's in our face, right, that we get a little flustered, right? I do too, frankly. Like I've never been a TV camera person, so Like I've never been a TV journalist, so even a camera on me has, I've stumbled before, right? So
Mhm.
yeah, I think being prepared is key, right? Because you know exactly which parts of the science you're going to be talking about, right? And sometimes just having a couple like point notes that you want to draw on, right? Like everybody can tell when you're reading off of paper. So try to just be prepared, right?
Hmm. Can you tell I'm reading off the paper right now?
I think you could probably tell I was reading off of paper for part of that because there was key points we wanted to hit, right? So yeah, absolutely. I think you can tell.
That is all we have planned for our conversation today. But if there are any questions for Colette, we have a few minutes. So with that, I think I will thank you, Colette.
Yeah, thank you. Nobody has any questions?
I'm sure they have a million questions, but like me, you don't want to ask them in a public forum, although I've just bared my ignorance or my supposed science here. So thank you so much again, Colette. And I look forward to working on that workshop with you in January.